International news now.
Okay, we're going to start with perhaps the most important question regarding the current military conflict between the United States and Iran, and that is, why did war break out in the first place? This is a complicated and increasingly controversial question because there have been several different explanations for the decision to go to war by President Trump. Now, we are going to provide you with a slightly different perspective than the one provided in the mass media by applying a theoretical model introduced in class, the bargaining model of war, to analyze President Trump's decision. First, we are going to briefly review the logic of the bargaining model of war and how it sees the initiation of war as a result of a bargaining failure. We will then review the concept of private information and how it contributes to bargaining failures. We will then apply both the bargaining model of war and the role of private information to the current conflict between the United States and Iran and how that led to the U.S. decision to initiate armed conflict with Iran. So,
can I pause for a second?
Yeah.
And just say that these are very tentative explanations, right? So the history on this is yet to be written, and we're relying largely on stuff that's sourced in major news outlets. There's lots of details that are that have yet to emerge, and so think about this as
details come on out. New details are coming out every day, right? And so this is our first cut, right? Okay, so the bargaining model of war starts with a couple of assumptions. The first assumption is that all wars have an underlying conflict of interest, a conflict between two or more adversaries. We can conceptualize that conflict in a couple of ways. First, we can think of it in terms of Iran's regional political influence, specifically its support for proxies like the Houthis and Hezbollah that threaten U.S. and Israeli allies in the region. The U.S. and Israel are trying to degrade the military power to limit Iran's support of these regional proxies. Second, we can also think about the conflict as a fight over Iran's possession of nuclear weapons. Third, we can also think about the conflict as a fight over who rules in Tehran. Namely, will it continue, the country of Iran continue to be run by fundamentalist clerics? Now, the second assumption is that all wars are costly for both sides due to the very high costs of war measured in casualties, destruction of infrastructure, and high financial costs of mobilizing military forces. Both sides would be better off if they found a peace settlement that provided each side with a tolerable outcome that allowed them to avoid war. As the slide notes, there is always a potential peace deal. So, the challenge of avoiding war is to find the terms of a peace deal that is acceptable to both sides, represented in the blue zone in the figure on the slide. In the current crisis, the United States and Iran clearly did not come to terms that allowed the two sides to avoid war. And so the question is, why not?
And that's going to bring us to the problem of private information. The basic bargaining model assumes that all parties have complete information. The bargaining model starts with an assumption that all parties have complete information. That is, that they know and agree on the relative distribution of military capabilities between the sides and the costs of war that each side will bear. And then the model relaxes this, because this is often not the case, as we will argue, and clearly not the case in the conflict between the United States and Iran. And so what happens when both sides don't know the other side's true military capacity or their costs they're going to face for going to war? So private information represents the privately held knowledge and beliefs on each side regarding the distribution of power and the costs that they'll face for going to war. So we'll talk more in the next segment about how the problem of private information contributed to the outbreak of war between the U.S. and Iran. The key point to note now, though, is that private information changes how each side sees their bargaining position and the thresholds or cut points on the divisive issue at which they're willing to fight a war rather than compromise. For example, if one side private information leads them to assume that their chance for military victory represented in P in the model, is much higher than their adversaries' chances, and their costs of war are lower, they will likely drive a harder bargain. They'll demand more, make more demands, raising the risk, making it harder for the other side to make concessions, and then raising the risk of a bargaining failure and the likelihood of war.
Right. Okay. So let's now apply the bargaining model of war and the problem of private information to the current conflict. First, let's review the underlying conflict between the United States and Iran. We can think about the two sides as fighting over a number of things: Iran's support for its regional proxies, Iran's nuclear war program, and the political interests who will rule Iran. The U.S. is effectively negotiating over Iran's military capacity to deprive it of the means to pursue these interests. This includes demanding an end to Iran's nuclear weapons program, calling for a reduction of its stockpiles of ballistic missiles, and pressuring Iran to cut off support to its proxy network of non-state militias like Hamas and Hezbollah. Iran was willing to talk about limits to its nuclear program, but not a complete end to it, and did not want to discuss its ballistic missiles or its relationship with international proxies. The potential peace deal was some type of limits on Iran's military that would be acceptable to both sides. Since the size, the positions of the United States and Iran were far apart on the underlying conflict, this deal was going to be very hard to find. Nevertheless, there should have been strong incentives to seek a peace deal because the costs of war were potentially very high, as we explained in our previous INN segment on the U.S.-Iran conflict about a month ago. For Iran, a war risked severe military losses to the point of complete degradation and even the collapse of the regime itself. For the United States, the risks were arguably lower because they were not existential. The United States wasn't risking the survival of its government, for example. However, the potential costs were still severe. The war could spread to threaten allies in the region and could disrupt the export of oil from the Middle East, which could upend the whole global economy. There could be American casualties and mission creep, leading to an extended engagement like previous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the potential costs were high, and so they should have been able, or at least tried very hard to seek a peace deal, but they didn't get it done.
Right, and why not? And so if we think about the problem of private information, it seems to provide at least a partial explanation. And so I'm going to give you 3 examples of how the presence of private information might have helped prevent or made it harder to reach a bargain that would have avoided the costs of war. And so first, the Trump administration seemed to believe that the United States possessed enormous advantages over Iran that would result in a successful and short military campaign at relatively low cost to the United States. A variety of factors likely contributed to the administration's confidence, including a successful attack on Iran's nuclear facilities that ended quickly and saw only a weak set of counterattacks from Iran. Moreover, Iran has been severely weakened by a set of political, economic, and military setbacks that made it vulnerable. And finally, the successful operation to remove the president of Venezuela provided evidence that the U.S. military could subdue an adversary with overwhelming firepower. So this belief in America's enormous military advantages led the United States to demand broad concessions from Iran on its nuclear program and ballistic missiles. When negotiations failed to produce these concessions, President Trump decided it was better to go to war than risk allowing Iran to drag out negotiations and potentially get less than he wanted. And part of the risk of dragging out negotiations, too, is greater time to rearm and build nuclear capacities. Right? So second, U.S. allies, most notably Israel, but also Saudi Arabia, were strongly encouraging the United States to use military force, arguing that military force could achieve a more complete resolution of the threat from Iran than would be possible through diplomacy. Behind the scenes, Israel was offering to jointly attack Iran, providing even more weight and pressure to these arguments. Now, the role of Israel in the start of the war is controversial and has sparked a debate over the level of influence that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had on President Trump's decision to launch military strikes. Secretary of State Marco Rubio contributed to this controversy when, in response to a question from a reporter asking, "Why now?" he said, quote, "We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces, and we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties." Now, some commentators have taken the statement as implying that Israel forced the United States to join the attack on Iran. Rubio later clarified the statement, saying that President Trump had already decided to use military force, and the Israeli operation only affected the timing of U.S. strikes. President Trump went further in response to a question on Israel's influence, saying Israel did not pressure him to attack, but rather he may have pressured Israel to attack before it was ready. The point here is not to resolve these competing narratives, but to point out that alliance politics provided another source of private information that emphasized the benefits of military action over further diplomacy. So finally, let's think about private information on the other side, Iran. Of course, we don't have public information such as press briefings to gain insights on the inner workings of the decision-making of Iran's leaders. However, we can see from their behavior during negotiations on the nuclear weapons program and their actions after the war started that Iran also held privately held beliefs that led them to prefer war over extensive concessions. Iran held firm on limiting negotiations to only the nuclear weapons question, even while the U.S. was assembling enormous military resources to the Persian Gulf. Iran also quickly expanded the war by attacking Gulf states and closing the Strait of Hormuz, suggesting it was ready to fight a war rather than to concede to the terms offered by the Trump administration.
Okay. So now we're going to examine the war aims of each, the United States and Iran. So we're going to start with the United States, and we should point out that these war aims are shifting and could also be a source of private information that is complicating the efforts to find a peace deal. We are going to begin our analysis of American goals for this war by playing a couple of clips from President Trump's speech on February 28th that announced the beginning of the war. So let's run those clips now.
Iran is the world's #1 state sponsor of terror and just recently killed tens of thousands of its own citizens on the street as they protested. It has always been the policy of the United States, in particular my administration, that this terrorist regime can never have a nuclear weapon. I'll say it again, they can never have a nuclear weapon. That is why in Operation Midnight Hammer last June, we obliterated the regime's nuclear program at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. After that attack, we warned them never to resume their malicious pursuit of nuclear weapons, and we sought repeatedly to make a deal. We tried. They wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. Again, they wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. They didn't know what was happening. They just wanted to practice evil. But Iran refused, just as it has for decades and decades. They've rejected every opportunity to renounce their nuclear ambitions, and we can't take it anymore. Instead, they attempted to rebuild their nuclear program and to continue developing long-range missiles that can now threaten our very good friends and allies in Europe, our troops stationed overseas, and could soon reach the American homeland. Just imagine how emboldened this regime would be if they ever had and actually were armed with nuclear weapons as a means to deliver their message. For these reasons, the United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. We're going to annihilate their Navy. We're going to ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region or the world and attack our forces, and no longer use their IEDs or roadside bombs, as they are sometimes called, to so gravely wound and kill thousands and thousands of people, including many Americans. And we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. It's a very simple message. They will never have a nuclear weapon. Finally, to the great, proud people of Iran, I say tonight that the hour of your freedom is at hand. Stay sheltered. Don't leave your home. It's very dangerous outside. Bombs will be dropping everywhere. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations. For many years, you have asked for America's help, but you never got it. No president was willing to do what I am willing to do tonight. Now you have a president who is giving you what you want. So let's see how you respond. America is backing you with overwhelming strength and devastating force. Now is the time to seize control of your destiny and to unleash the prosperous and glorious future that is close within your reach. This is the moment for action. Do not let it pass.
Okay, so let me say a few things here. First of all, the Trump administration has offered several different reasons for going to war with Iran. Some of these reasons, such as regime change, and let's define that. Regime change of overthrowing the Islamic Republic and replacing it with a different form of government, were emphasized early, as you just saw, in the campaign, but have now largely been abandoned by President Trump. Nevertheless, we're going to review all of these goals that have been articulated because they establish expectations that will ultimately be used to judge the success or failure of this operation. Now, the first goal that he repeated quite often here was, as the reason for going to war, was the United States demanding that Iran end its ability to ever produce a nuclear weapon. This goal is in line with longstanding U.S. policy. Since President George W. Bush, all U.S. presidents, both Democrats and Republicans, have worked to prevent Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon. President Trump ordered military strikes, as he mentioned in the clip, in June 2025 to destroy nuclear weapons facilities in Iran. He argued that recent diplomacy did not produce enough concessions from Iran. They wanted to have a deal, they didn't want to have the deal, they didn't know what was going on, was his words. And so because he wasn't getting enough concessions, some promises that Iran would never have a nuclear weapon, then he resorted to a military option. Now, the current campaign has built on earlier attacks on nuclear facilities last June. In particular, strikes have further damaged the Natanz nuclear facility. However, there are limits to how much airstrikes can end Iran's nuclear weapons program. And that's where the problems really start here. Strikes can destroy facilities, but cannot eliminate the key asset of scientific knowledge on how to build nuclear weapons. Moreover, Iran still possesses a stockpile of highly enriched uranium that could be used to build nuclear weapons in a matter of months. Seizing or destroying that material would require a very sophisticated military operation that would necessarily involve American boots on the ground in Iran. Now, it should also be noted that the case for Iran's need for nuclear deterrence to protect itself from outside attack from countries like the United States has actually been strengthened, not weakened. In short, if Iran's Islamic Republic survives this war, and it looks like it's going to, at least right now, it will likely have even stronger incentives to develop nuclear weapons because it has now seen the reality of what can happen without that deterrent effect of nuclear weapons. So there's that.
Yeah, and just compare the Iranian case with the North Korean case, right? The lesson is if you have nuclear weapons, you can deter wars of regime change.
Right.
So second, U.S. goals include the degradation of Iran's conventional military capacity. I would say that this goal is the one that's most directly in line with the military strikes undertaken by the United States. Perhaps the most successful aspect of the U.S. military strikes thus far is the destruction of Iran's ballistic missiles and drones and its capacity to rebuild those weapons. Commentators have estimated the degradation of military assets by tracking the rapid decline in the number of missile and drone launches by Iran over the last few weeks of war. According to an article in Al Jazeera, Iranian ballistic missile launches have fallen by more than 90%, from 350 launches on February 28th to roughly 25 by March 14th. Drone launches tell the same story. Iran launched more than 800 drones on day 1 of the conflict, but only 75 launches on day 15. Now, this suggests that Iran is running out of these weapons and is starting to ration them. Similarly, the U.S. military has destroyed much of Iran's naval forces. By mid-March, U.S. officials reported more than 60 Iranian vessels had been destroyed or disabled. This campaign rendered Iranian naval forces largely combat ineffective in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Now, President Trump has repeatedly noted a third pillar of Iran's military capacity, that is, militant non-state groups like Hamas and Hezbollah that have coordinated with Iran to threaten U.S. regional allies, particularly Israel. The end of such cooperation has been a regular demand of the Trump administration. However, any military actions to attack and degrade these groups have been by Israel, which has launched an extensive military campaign in southern Lebanon, rather than the United States. Now, finally, President Trump explicitly declared regime change as a goal in his announcement of the beginning of military action against Iran. You saw that in the clip. It's interesting to see how much emphasis he placed on this goal at the end of the speech. Overthrowing the regime is the most difficult of all the goals President Trump announced, especially without an American land invasion to defeat Iran's military and security forces and then occupy the country. Now, President Trump has already stepped back from this goal because it has been clear that the regime is not likely to fall due to the airstrikes alone, and that the regime is willing to use overwhelming force against Iranian citizens who protest in the streets.
Okay, so now we have established the war aims of the United States, so let's look at the war aims for Iran. The following clip we're going to play here is from the Canadian Broadcast Company, and it highlights one aspect of Iran's strategy, and that is the use of asymmetrical warfare through the deployment of thousands of low-cost drones. And so let's run that clip now.
As the Iran war continues, the U.S. and its allies have a problem, a drone problem. It's the kind of drones Iran is using. They're cheap and they're plentiful.
They're using these, what's being described as one-way attack drones that are very low cost, can be made in great numbers. They hide them and they're mobile, the launchers for these, and then they launch them.
Retired U.S. Vice Admiral Kevin Donegan has overseen operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen.
You're seeing them used to hit hotels. You're seeing them used to hit oil infrastructure, gas infrastructure, and airports, right?
This is Iran's weapon of choice, the Shahed 136. It costs about $20,000 to $50,000 to make. It's not an extremely complicated device. It uses GPS, it has an engine and a propeller. You may recognize the distinctive sound from videos like this attack on the capital of Bahrain. And with a range of up to 2,500 kilometers, a drone launched from Tehran could reach Mumbai or Athens. How do you defend such a large area with so many targets from this drone threat? Christopher Preble is with a global security think tank.
They are being intercepted by a range of things, from the THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, the Patriot batteries, which have been around for a long time.
And here we get to the math, the critical cost differential of shooting cheap drones out of the sky. Each Patriot missile costs $4 to $5 million. and the THAAD interceptors run at least 12 million. Meanwhile, Iran is reported to have thousands of drones with potentially more on the way.
They are far easier to manufacture, of course, than a missile. They're smaller, for one thing, and so they can be. And we've seen this in the Ukraine war, how many new manufacturers have come online in the Ukraine to build a drone.
And how long does it take to re-stockpile the kind of high-end missiles that allies and America and Israel are using to knock these drones out of the sky?
That's a really good question. We know that the Trump administration is putting pressure on the manufacturers of these weapons to ramp up production. But I think as a realistic sort of prospect, we're talking about them increasing their production by hundreds, not by thousands.
The drones aren't perfect. They don't need to be.
So the interception rate is relatively high in the grand scheme of things. I've seen numbers north of 90%. And yet that 10% can cause a lot of damage, especially when you're hitting a relatively soft target. You know, it's almost like the defender has to be perfect and the attacker just has to be lucky.
So the first thing to note here is that the Iranian regime has one very simple goal as the basis for its strategy in this war, and that goal is to survive. After the war ends, if the current government of Iran is still in control, Iran will claim that it won the war. The question is, how can Iran survive against the combined force of two countries, the United States and Israel, that have much greater military resources at their disposal than Iran? And the potential answer here is to use asymmetrical warfare. A country with a weaker military can win a war and has won wars against a stronger adversary if victory is defined as survival and it can strategically use military resources to inflict a high enough cost on its stronger opponent so that that opponent ends the conflict without completing its mission. Now note here that Iran does not have to defeat the U.S. military. That would be impossible. Instead, it only has to raise the cost for the United States to a level high enough that it feels pressure to end the conflict before achieving all of its goals. Now, how does Iran do that? First, it uses hundreds, as the clip explains, hundreds of, and even thousands of inexpensive drones against targets to force the United States and its allies to use much more expensive interceptor missiles to shoot down Iran's missiles and drones. As the clip noted, the interceptor missiles are very effective. They destroy 90% of Iran's attacks from missiles and drones. However, the weapons that make it through these defenses still cause considerable damage. And they also achieve one other goal, and that is to force the United States and its allies to expand these really expensive defensive missile systems, and they are arguably going to eventually run out of those resources. Now, second, Iran has expanded the war to increase costs for the United States and its allies, particularly Gulf states. This was a risk for Iran, since Gulf states have tried to manage their relationships with Iran and avoid attacks by keeping their distance from conflicts between Iran and the United States. The purpose of attacking neighbors is to increase pressure on the United States to stop the war. If these neighbors suffer costs from the war, countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman may lobby the United States to end the war sooner. Now, the risks are that these states will be driven further into the security orbit of the United States and no longer will try to coexist peacefully with Iran. And those risks are kind of coming into play here. There was a recent New York Times article that said that the leader of Saudi Arabia, MBS, was pressuring or encouraging the United States to continue the war, not to stop it, because he thinks that this is a historical opportunity to kind of finish off the Iranian regime.
So finally and most effectively, Iran has basically closed the Strait of Hormuz to increase economic pain and all other states in the global economy by driving up the price of oil. This has become the central act of escalation in the war so far. As we noted in our last news segment on the conflict with Iran, the Strait of Hormuz is a narrow shipping waterway that normally handles about 20% of the world's daily movement or exports of oil and liquefied natural gas. Iran is geographically situated along the strait, which enables it to use military force to close it.
Can I interject?
Yeah, yeah.
It was right at this point where I was writing this that I almost played a clip of us saying the biggest risk of the U.S. attacking Iran is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah. So we don't want to say I told you so, but
we weren't the only ones.
Well, of
Lots
course,
of
if guys like us can be like, what about the Strait of Hormuz? Yeah. This was a real risk, and they factored it in, but I think the United States didn't count on it happening so early and so powerfully and effectively. Yes. That's the problem.
So let's talk. Iran uses several layers of military forces to threaten commercial vessels in the region. First, Iran deploys land-based missiles and drones along its southern coastline, and Iran has used missiles and one-way attack drones as some of its most potent tools against shipping and regional energy infrastructure. The risk of even a single successful strike is enough to deter commercial traffic and raise insurance costs. And this is a big part of this. As the risks of Iranian strikes have increased, then insurers tell these big shipping companies, we're not going to pay insurance. Right. And so that means
they
then...
just cancel the insurance.
And
they
just cancel
even raise it really high, they just say no.
Yeah, and so then what that means is the owner of the shipping company would have to absorb the losses from the ships going down, which are huge, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Right? So second, Iran uses naval mines to threaten oil tankers. These include limpet mines placed directly on ship hulls, moored mines that float just below the surface, and bottom mines that are released using sensors when a ship is nearby. Clearing mines is a long and dangerous operation. They're also a powerful determinant. Fear alone that there may be mines can, again, paralyze the shipping industry. Finally, Iran also uses large numbers of fast armed speedboats operated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps to threaten shipping. These small vessels can carry weapons such as rocket-propelled grenades and can maneuver quickly through crowded sea lions, that too probably, sea lanes, making them difficult to detect and intercept. By combating land-based strikes, hidden mines, and fast-moving armed speedboats, Iran raises the costs and risks of transit high enough to disrupt global energy flows and pressure the United States, despite its limited military capabilities.
We should pause here again. Iran is doing this without a navy. The United States has been very successful in this military campaign. They have destroyed all the ballistic missiles, or most of them. They have, demolished Iran's navy. The key here is to understand asymmetrical warfare, right? With a few speedboats and some mines, they can still close the Strait of Hormuz. And it's going to take the United States and huge destroyers and an incredible mobilization of military force to reopen that very same strait. And so the asymmetry is key here.
And at the end of the last clip that we showed you is significant, right? The defender, in this case the United States and its allies, the defender of commercial shipping, they have to be perfect.
Perfect, right.
Iran,
it only takes one to get through.
Yeah, Iran only takes one. So Iran, the aggressor, in this case, the aggressor it only needs to be lucky.
Yeah.
So this strategic leverage has allowed Iran to inflict immense economic pain in the United States and the entire global economy. Over 10 million barrels of oil per day have been taken out of the market. This makes the Strait of Hormuz crisis the largest oil disruption in history, according to the International Energy Agency. So let's get more specific on the fallout of this closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So global oil prices have shot up by roughly 30%, from $70 per barrel to about $100 per barrel. U.S. gas, and again, it had been as high as $115 or $118 per barrel. U.S. gasoline prices have increased by over $1 a gallon. So when you fill up your tank, I told this to my kids, we just paid the Iran war fee.
Yeah.
Right? In terms of the difference between filling up your tank now and 3 or 4 weeks ago. In some states like California and Arizona, the price of gas is over $5 per gallon now.
I mean, there's memes out there, and there's like photos of $8 a gallon in some places.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like ridiculously high.
So diesel fuel, which is critical for trucking and agriculture, has surged even higher, increasing by around 35%. So other types of energy have spiked as well. Liquefied natural gas markets have spiked, especially in Europe, up by more than 50%, and Asia, where liquid natural gas prices have doubled. Jet fuel costs have increased from 50 to 75%, driving up airline fares by 10 to 15%, 10 to 25%. Again, sorry about summer travel plans. So given how pervasively the effect of energy costs impacts all aspects of the economy, these higher energy costs will surely increase overall inflation. And last week, the Federal Open Market Committee meets, and Jerome Powell talks about this, and they've had to take in these oil shocks on the likelihood of inflation as well. And one of the ways to understand the impact of this is look at anything that you have, any possession, relies on the price of oil.
Right.
This shirt, these shirts, pants, watches, computers, all these things were shipped, which means that transportation costs that's powered largely by oil and its derivatives have contributed to the costs of every product that you have. And so when there is a shock in energy prices, the price of everything else goes up as well.
A good example is agriculture, right? I mean, fertilizer has become incredibly more expensive, and this is now the planting season in much of the United States. And diesel has shot way up, and so these farmers are facing much greater input costs than they ever had. And the only way that they're going to recoup on any of those costs is that the price of food is going to have to go way up. And so what this really does also highlight, and the next topic we're going to talk about here, is the Trump administration, if it wants to avoid the domestic costs of this war, because people are really going to get upset about this war when everything becomes the kind of face the inflationary pressures that we had just a couple of years ago. Inflation really damaged the Biden administration incredibly, and they couldn't recover, right? And so he's on a time crunch now. He has to stop this as soon as possible. So if it goes 2 more weeks or a month, then it's going to, even if he could solve it a month later, the repercussions and the length of time it's going to take for prices to adjust is going to be too long, and the elections will happen.
And the comparison here to the Biden administration is important. The inflation spike, so inflation was going up over the administration, but its worst spike was in response to the war in Ukraine, and then the price and energy prices then spiked there over the second quarter of 2022. And politically, the Biden administration didn't recover from that.
And they lost the election. And the Republicans swept. They had united government, right? Unified government. All right, so now let's change tact here and kind of update you on the conflict by taking a look at U.S. options to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, right? That is the kind of core crux of where this conflict is centered on, is what to do about the Strait of Hormuz. And so we're going to start with an audio clip from the New York Times, the daily podcast that does a good job of summarizing the problems facing the United States in trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So let's roll that clip now.
So the first option is, how do you deal with this problem of the Strait of Hormuz that we've been discussing? And one of the options on the table is for the U.S. Navy, perhaps with other countries, to basically conduct tanker escorts, where you have Navy ships that would escort commercial vessels out of the Persian Gulf and then take other ships back in. These are probably be Navy destroyers that are equipped with special radar that can track incoming missiles, deal with drones, that kind of thing. They would almost certainly be accompanied by drones and helicopters overhead that could also detect drones, not only in the air, but in the sea. They would be looking for threats on the shoreline, And they'd be keeping an eye out for those speedboats that we talked about with the gunmen on board who might fire an RPG at vessels. So it would be a very complex operation where
Yeah.
you'd have to have dedicated as many of 12 or so of these specialized destroyers, leading some number of commercial vessels through this strait, which is 21 miles at its narrowest point. You're going through channels. And again, they're having to go through this as they look for all these different threats that could pop up at any given time. And if you look at it, the possibility of a missile getting through one of these warships, getting hit, and maybe American sailors being wounded or killed, that's also very much a distinct possibility.
Right.
And the ultimate decision here will rest with the shipping companies that own these vessels as well as their insurers to see, is it worth, even with the protection of the U.S. military and perhaps the militaries of other countries that donate ships, is it worth the risk of getting your cargo through? That's the risk that they have to balance.
Right.
Versus holding off and waiting for some kind of diplomatic solution, which right now, the chances look quite remote of achieving anything like that.
Yeah, I cannot imagine being a captain on one of these tankers, imagining such a voyage. So that option does sound bad, does sound incredibly risky. What's the next one?
So the second main option is basically taking over a place called Karj Island. This is a small island in the northern part of the Persian Gulf off the Iranian coast, which is Iran's main oil hub. About 90% of its oil production go through this place. And just last week, on President Trump's orders, the U.S. military bombed the military installations. Over 90 targets were hit on this island itself. These are the military emplacements that protect the oil infrastructure there. Now, the president at that time said, I ordered the Pentagon to avoid hitting the oil infrastructure because of the long-term economic impact this would have not only on Iran, when the time comes if you want to help, rebuild its economy, but also the impact it would have on the global economy, the shock that would have of taking, the Iranian oil, which continues to flow through the Strait of Hormuz, by the way, taking that off the table.
Right. It sounds completely counterproductive to imagine a strike that would just blow up the entire infrastructure of Iran's oil economy, right?
Right. So what's the option? Okay, so one option is to take those Marines that are steaming, from the Pacific region, and they have them do some kind of amphibious landing or some other kind of military operation to seize control of this strategic island and pressure the regime to concede on other fronts because the Americans control this very important economic hub for Iran.
All right. So first, let me say something. I would argue that the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz has become the highest priority of the United States in this war. All of the Trump administration's latest military and political moves have been centered on getting the strait open to oil exports to relieve the economic pressure on the global economy. And this is important to note because it highlights how Iran's move to close the Strait of Hormuz has provided some meaningful leverage over the conflict. Now, the problem for the United States is its options for reopening the strait are limited, risky, and slow. They're likely to take several weeks at least to complete. This is bad news because the longer that the strait remains restricted, the more pain for the U.S. and the global economy, and the more leverage for Iran. So, what are the options for the United States to reopen the Strait of Hormuz? First, there are a series of military options to take out Iran's layered forces that currently threaten shipping in the strait. That includes military strikes against land-based missiles and drones on Iran's southern coastline. So they have all these forces arrayed on the southern coastline. They can easily fire into the Strait of Hormuz. The United States has already attacked these forces with a lot of success. They have sharply reduced the number of armaments that are there. But the problem is that Iran has retained some capabilities because they're hidden and fortified and all of this. And even a small number of surviving launchers or drones could strike slow-moving tankers. They're kind of sitting ducks right there, and that's the big problem. And that's going to undermine the confidence of the waterway's safety, right? Second, the U.S. and its allies can start clearing mines in the strait. And this is where the Trump administration, President Trump, made an appeal to other countries to help with this, and he got largely rebuffed by the allies, and he's still pretty sore about that. But clearing mines is a problem too. It takes a long time, it's very dangerous, it could lead to casualties of vulnerable mine clearing vessels and their crew. Finally, there is the deterrence problem again, right? It's impossible to know if you cleared all the mines away, and so commercial vessels might not be willing to take that risk even when you undergo all of this trouble, right? And finally, the U.S. could provide naval escorts for oil tankers, and this would take a lot of time and a lot of firepower. Escorting even a handful of ships would require a high ratio of destroyers, these big naval destroyers, to commercial vessels. Moreover, Iran could potentially strike both the commercial tankers and their escorts. And even one fast little speedboat with a rocket-propelled grenade could slip through all of this, right? They're more maneuverable than these huge ships and destroyers, and could sink or damage these tankers, right? And so that again would serve as a deterrent. If they could just do that once, it would probably stop the whole operation. So, and how long can you keep this up, right? I mean, Iran is in a pretty advantageous spot, unfortunately, right?
Right.
And
the challenge here is, if you think about how do you get peace in the strait, you need both sides to agree to the deal. And
the only way to do this in any kind of time frame that would help the United States is to have Iran agree to reopen the strait, which kind of gives us to our next option.
Yeah, so that brings us to option number 2, a U.S. operation against Karg Island. Karg Island is Iran's key oil export hub that handles up to about 90% of Iran's oil exports. Thus, it's a key economic asset that's vital to the entire Iranian economy. Last week, the U.S. destroyed military assets on the island, but not its oil infrastructure. President Trump posted on social media that the U.S. refrained from destroying the oil facilities because they are vital to Iran's economy. However, he threatened that the U.S. would come back and destroy the oil assets unless Iran reopens the Strait of Hormuz. Let's pause for a second here. This is signaling. This is signaling going on through war, right? He's saying, I could have hit this, but I didn't. He's trying to send credible signals to pressure Iran to back off the Strait of Hormuz, but also trying to hold out a carrot, right, and saying that he's being conciliatory by not completely destroying the oil economy. As the clip points out, destroying everything on Karg Island would not make strategic sense, that this would take Iran's oil off the global market, which would raise the global price of oil even higher. Instead, the U.S. could deploy the 4,000 plus Marines who are on their way to the Middle East in a military operation to seize Karg Island. This would give the United States control over Iran's oil exports, which is the basis of the economy. President Trump could then use this leverage to pressure the Iranian regime to reopen the strait. The problem is that this operation will require deploying U.S. troops on the ground in Iranian territory, and this would not be a simple operation. It would require an amphibious landing by these Marines. They would have to go through the Strait of Hormuz to get to Karg Island. Iran could see them coming, could attack them with all the missiles, drones, and armed speedboats they use to keep the strait closed. Right. Then, if the U.S. if U.S. forces did succeed in capturing Karg Island, they would have to hold and protect it. They would become a target. And finally, there's no guarantee that trying to capture Karg Island would pressure Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and that it would work. There would still likely need to be a negotiation, and Iran would want something in return, besides just the return of Karg Island, for relieving the economic pressure they've inflicted on the whole global economy. And we should add one, so we're just talking about this solely in military terms, but the deployment of U.S. troops on the ground some Republicans in Congress have said this would create a constitutional crisis because it would require the president to come. They've said that this is our line in the sand. It would require the president to come to Congress to get authorization to use a military force. Technically, right, and he hasn't done that yet, and so technically, right, legally, we're not fighting, the U.S. is not fighting a war because of that.
And Congress, not to get too far off the topic here, but there is a request for a huge budget outlay for future payment on this war, right? And so Congress will get another chance to weigh in on this as well. Okay, so we're going to close now, and we're going to talk about potential end scenarios. But first, let's I want to bring you up to date on the latest developments. As of Tuesday, March 24th, when we're
at 3
recording.
p.m.
At 3 p.m. There you go. Central Standard.
No, it's daylight time. We went to daylight savings.
He's the guy that's constantly in charge of knowing if it's daylight or standard. He's kind of a little special about that. So late last week, President Trump threatened that the United States would strike Iranian power plants unless Iran reopened the Strait of Hormuz. However, he then announced a pause for 5 days until Friday, March 27th, because the United States and Iran were engaging in, quote, very strong talks, according to President Trump, to resolve the whole conflict, right? The entire conflict, and bring it to a close. Now, the problem is that officials in Iran denied that any serious negotiations were underway, and they claimed that President Trump was just trying to calm rattled energy markets with these exaggerated statements. And Iranian leaders, though, later acknowledged that Iran and the United States have been exchanging messages, usually through an intermediary, about de-escalating the conflict. Now, President Trump then added a bit more information, saying that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, were leading negotiations, and that the United States was communicating with one of Iran's leaders. He didn't say who it was, but he did say it wasn't the recently named Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. Okay, so now that we've got to, that's it, right? Is there any other thing you want to add?
No, markets closed today. They were at 3 o'clock. They were 3 o'clock Central Daylight Time. They were down slightly. They rallied on Monday.
Because of what he said,
because of what Trump said about that there was this pause and talks. Yeah.
Right. And so now we're going to have a little bit of a discussion here about what I would consider the two most likely options left for the United States in this war. And spoiler alert, neither one of them really are without substantial risks. Okay, so option number one, and the one that seems to be President Trump's current preferred option, would be to end the conflict as soon as possible and declare victory. And the logic here, from the Trump administration's perspective, would be that they could make a claim that many of their goals have already been achieved, particularly the degradation of conventional Iranian military forces, ballistic missiles and the like. And so this would have a lot of advantages for the Trump administration and for the United States and the global economy, right? And so the biggest pro here is that it avoids an extended American war, which is something that I think he always went into this war thinking that it needed to be a short conflict, and you know, just stopping and declaring victory would make it a short conflict. Another big goal of his, and would potentially be achieved but not guaranteed, would that be if he could just stop the conflict, declare victory, then the economic pain to the global economy and the U.S. Domestic economy could end. That's not necessarily the case. For one thing, it's going to take some time to recover from this shock. And secondly, there's not a guarantee that if the United States ends the conflict, Iran's going to agree. It's going to take both sides to decide to end the conflict. And now that it seems like the United States is more interested in ending the conflict, Iran might hold out to get better terms, right? And that's going to be a problem. And that leaves us with the big cons here, and that is that ending the conflict early would leave the regime in place, which goes against one of his goals for regime change, and it would not fully destroy Iran's nuclear program. And so if you think back to that speech, most of it was about making sure that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, and then the end of the speech was this strong endorsement of a regime change in Iran. Neither one of those things would be accomplished, and they would then remain continuing problems of how to manage Iran. And so there would be a lot of critique and like, why did we do this in the first place sort of talk.
Can I add a little bit on the economic, ending the economic pain? One of the challenges here, so two things, right? Again, Iran's got to agree to this, but the other challenge with ending the economic pain is, and I saw something about this yesterday, energy markets don't know, the argument was that energy markets are trading on bad information. They don't know the scope of the damage to the oil infrastructure in the Middle East, to Iran, to Iraq, yes. Yeah. Because in a lot of places, they've shut down oil extraction because they can't get it, they don't have any more storage capacity, and it's just sitting on boats in the Persian Gulf. So they've stopped producing, but at the same time, there have been all these attacks on the infrastructure. And so the argument is that oil markets and futures markets, they have imperfect information here. We don't know the scope of the damage that's been done to the oil infrastructure in the region. And so the idea that if the war just stops and Iran quits attacking, that there aren't going to be further supply disruptions, his argument was that we don't know if that's going to be the case now, which means longer pain and the like.
And I think about the worst case scenario in that first potential endgame. You stop the war, and you stop the bombing, and the Iranian regime stays in place, and it has a new, younger, arguably more hardline ruler, right? And so that's going to continue to be a problem. It retains the basics of its nuclear program, especially the highly enriched uranium, highly damaged, but not completely shut off. And so that continues to be a threat. And if they don't get the immediate, reduction in the economic pain, that's a pretty bad combination of things.
Well,
right?
What's the other lesson that the Iranian regime has learned here? That they can hold the Strait hostage.
There's a proof of concept here.
Yeah, right. And so they can. So if you imagine a peace deal, they can hold the administration's feet to the fire, potentially asking for new concessions along the way, and always just say, "Okay, we're going to close the Strait if you don't."
It's a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the other. There's either you stop the war or you continue the war. Those are the two options, right? So let's talk about the option of continuing. What would be the logic argue in favor of that? And the logic there would be the same thing he's hearing from some of his allies, and particularly right now, Saudi Arabia. He's like, this is a historical opportunity. The only real way to permanently solve the Iranian problem is to overthrow the regime, and the only way to overthrow the regime is to continue the war. And if you look into what the reporting is, and you got to take out that with a grain of salt. No one's really officially saying what those two, or he's hearing from Saudi leaders and what he's saying to them, but they are promoting a ground invasion of Iran to get rid of the regime, which would be a huge escalation, right? But that's the argument. That's going to be the argument from Israel. That's the argument from Saudi Arabia. That's the argument from some parts of his team, surely, is that why did we do this if we're not going to finish the job, right?
And
so that's the first thing.
And the challenge with regime change is what replaces it? And here, the allies have different views on this. Israel appears to be more tolerant of a failed state.
Sure.
And Saudi Arabia is really concerned about a failed state. And so it's right. It's not, and then the U.S. Learned this the hard way in Iraq. Right. If you topple a government, then this raises questions about what comes next. And there's no way that you can anticipate that a moderate regime with somewhat friendly interests to the United States and its allies in the region would necessarily come to power.
It's a huge uncertainty and risk, right? Because, and then you're entering into the nation building zone that
they said they don't want to do.
Yeah, and President Trump really built his career, particularly at the beginning in that 2016 campaign, with critiquing previous regimes for doing exactly that, right?
The other thing that I think is important to think about in terms of this conversation about regime change and what's possible and what's not possible, we have some evidence that the regime was pretty robust in January and February when it engaged in widespread repression and coercion, right? Its security forces killed tens of thousands of people to put down dissidents and to put down a revolt. That's significant in terms of telling you about the command structure of the security forces and how they're still very coherent and still willing to repress and unified and willing to repress if they need to. And if you're talking about casualty numbers that Iran has suffered from this war, there's lots of civilians, but it's nowhere in the range where you would have significant degradation of their internal security forces.
Yeah, their military casualties have not been that high, right? And so the pros of this, of course, is that if it's successful, and that's a big if, that would be the way to complete the maximal war aims. Like if you did successfully continue a war and actually somehow either seize the highly enriched uranium or bury it entombed in there. I've seen reports about that kind of strategy. You could end Iran's nuclear program, but they would take something like that, not the campaign as it currently stands. And so that's the big pro, is that you could kind of permanently solve this Iran problem. But the risks are severe, right? The risks are, escalation, military action, a lot more casualties for the United States, especially if you start creeping into a ground war, right? The extension of the economic pain. So any extension of this war is going to create even more pressure on energy markets. One forecast had oil prices shooting up to like $180 per barrel if it lasts through April. Much less. I mean, it would have to last a lot longer than April if they did something like this. And then the final thing I want to note, and then we're going to have to end here, is this would be a real risk for the political base that has undergirded, especially Donald Trump, but also the whole Republican Party. And so they run a huge risk, especially with an election in November, if they continue this war. And so that's the
And it looks like so far his support coalition in Congress is holding firm. The public opinion polling suggests that he's losing independents, but Republicans are holding with the president. Where we see split in the coalition is among the talking heads and influencers in the Republican coalition, and there's a real split.
Yeah, you gotta realize though that I would say that's holding in 3 or 4 weeks of war, 3 or 4 months of war. And especially if it really has the economic pain that is currently being inflicted. I just can't imagine that won't start eroding the base and the actual voters, not just the commentators.
Right, and here's the challenges of fighting a war like this. Voters are reminded every time they fill up their car what the costs of the war are.
Right.
And in terms of the cost that they're paying, not the entire aggregate cost, but the fact that they're paying costs for the war every time. So we're out of time. We're not sure what the last one will be, but we'll adjust to the news. We'll see you next time.